Good morning, everyone. My name is Jacques Gauthier. I'm an assistant professor at the French National Geographic Institute, and I will present you work I've done with several of my colleagues, especially Maria Jesus Lobo, about the visualization of COVID-19 cases for the identification of spatio-temporal structures. Since the beginning of the pandemic, we saw a lot of examples of dashboard visualizations of COVID-19 related data, integrating interactive maps with synchronized temporal diagrams, and showing different levels of complexity and interaction possibilities. In the major part of this dashboard visualization, the relationships between the temporal and the spatial components of the data was visualized with interactive map representing the spatial distribution of data for one specific time step selected on a temporal diagram, or with animated map representing different temporal states of the data spatial distribution, or with temporal diagrams representing the temporal evolution of the data categorized by spatial regions. But other works propose more complex visualizations, proposing to represent directly on the same graphic representation the temporal and the spatial component of the data, using integrated diagrams or specifically designed glyphs into a 2D map, or representing the temporal and the spatial component of the data inside a 3D representation using the space-time cube principles. These visualizations, while being more difficult to interpret, propose an overall visualization of the spatio-temporal distribution of the data, allowing the identification of structures. So from all these visualizations, we ask ourselves the following questions. How to visualize COVID-19 related data in order to visually identify spatio-temporal dynamics in the evolution of the pandemic, and especially how to visualize COVID-19 cases in order to identify successive phases of the pandemic by observing spatio-temporal clusters related to successive time periods, propagation axis of the pandemic, or local temporal trends. To do so, we investigated two visualization approaches. The first is inspired from the growth ring map methods, which propose to combine in a 2D map the use of color to represent time and the use of a specifically designed glyph in order to represent the temporal distribution of spatially aggregated event data. The second approach is inspired from the space-time cube methods, which propose to represent in a 3D visualization the geographical space with the two first axes of the visualization and the temporal dimension with the third axis of the visualization. And we applied these two methods to the visualization of a synthetic event datasets representing COVID-19 cases. I will first present you our growth ring map approach. The principle of the growth ring map can be described this way. An image dataset is represented on a 2D map by punctual entities bearing a color representing the event's temporal period of appearance. Then the spatially closed events are aggregated on the map and represented by one punctual entities whose area represents the number of aggregated events. This punctual entity is formed by concentric rings of different colors, the area of each ring representing the proportion inside this aggregate of events which appear during the same temporal period. And this representation allows a visual identification of spatio-temporal clusters by observing glyphs presenting a higher proportion of one specific color. For example, here, by observing the glyph presenting a higher proportion of dark red color, we can identify spatio-temporal clusters corresponding to the first concentration of event in time and space in the explored spatio-temporal window. We integrated this representation into an interactive visualization environment, allowing the users to navigate between different spatial scales through zoom in the map and using broadcast aggregation of the easy event datasets. These environments allow also the users to navigate between different temporal scales by allowing him to redefine the used color scale and temporal classification. And so these environments allow the users to focus its analysis on a particular spatio-temporal window. So like I said before, we also worked on the space-time cube approach, where we first chose to represent each case by a point, forming a 3D point cloud. This representation quickly showed problem of visual cluttering due to the amount of represented data. And so we investigated the possibility to spatially aggregate the data using a hexagonal grid and to represent the evolution, the temporal evolution of the number of cases in each hexagonal cell by a 3D column placed above each cell. So these 3D columns are formed by a stack of 3D elements, each 3D element having the same height and representing the number of cases for the corresponding hexagonal cell for one temporal interval. So this representation allows the users to visually compare the temporal evolution of the number of cases in different spatial regions while keeping the location of these regions visible in the spatial representation and perhaps also their spatial proximity. So this representation is also integrated into an interactive visualization environment, allowing the user to change its point of view, but also to navigate between different spatial and temporal scales by zooming into the 3D visualization. For example, here when the user is zooming in, the hexagonal grid we use to aggregate our data is replaced by a finer one, and also the temporal evolution of the number of cases in each hexagonal cell is represented with a finer 3D element and so with a finer temporal granularity. Something you don't see here is when the user is zooming enough, the 3D columns are replaced by the original 3D point cloud. This visualization environment also allows the user to select the 3D column corresponding to one hexagonal cell, allowing him to analyze more precisely the temporal evolution of the number of cases in one particular area. These two propositions are integrated into two independent web applications available on GitHub. These two applications integrates a user interface allowing the dynamic modification of the different visualization parameters. So even if we need some proper user evaluation of our prototypes, our first explorations seems to show that the growth ring map proposition appears to be the most suited for the identification of clusters and, in a lesser extent, of propagation axes in the distribution of event data, while the 3D visualizations appears to be the most suited for the comparison of local temporal trends. Therefore, we can propose different use cases for our two propositions. For example, a user could perform a first overall visualization of one dataset using the growth ring map methods in order to identify successive phases of the epidemic in one region during one temporal period. Here, for example, the user could first look for the glyph presenting a dark red color in order to identify where are the first outbreaks of the epidemic, and then look for glyphs presenting an orange color in order to identify where the epidemic is spreading just after these first outbreaks. Then you can see on the temporal diagrams on the right of the screen that the number of cases reach a peak represented in white, and you can see that the events corresponding to this peak represented in white in the map are present all over the studied area. But the user could then look for glyphs presenting a higher proportion of blue color in order to see where there is still concentrations of new events after this large peak of the number of cases during the decreasing period of the epidemic in this area. And so, even if this particular dataset is not very suited for this, but another use case could be that after the interpretation of propagation axis of the epidemic from the identification of these different spatio-temporal clusters. For example, here on these datasets, we identify a first series of clusters corresponding to, in red, to the first concentration of events, and then another series of clusters here in white corresponding to spatio-temporal clusters appearing a bit later. And from the location of these successive clusters, we could interpret some propagation axes of the epidemic. Finally, another use case could be after observing spatio-temporal clusters in the growth ring map pro visualization to switch to the 3D visualization in order to analyze more precisely the temporal evolution of the number of cases in the identified areas. For example, to compare the speed of the epidemic spread in these particular regions. So in order to enhance the combined use of these two visualizations for the analysis of COVID-19 cases datasets, our first main work concerns the combination of these two visualizations, which imply that we have to work on the transition, the visual transition between the 2D and the 3D visualizations, but also on the transition between the different spatial and temporal scales we represent. Finally, another thing we have to focus on attention on is the aggregation methods we have to use in this different proposition. So that's the end of my talk. I thank you very much for attending it, and I encourage yourself to contact us if you have any questions about our work. Thank you.